Hello and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr. McDonald. In this episode, I'll be having a general discussion of part 2 of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I'll be basically having a nice summary and covering more or less all the thematic things that are touched upon within part 2. So it's a nice way to sort of touch upon what all these various musings on different topics that happen within each part of the Zarathustra as a whole, take it all together and ultimately see what exactly is being argued for overall within the specific part. In the first part, just to briefly go back over what we've covered so far, we had the nice general discussion and talk about the way in which part 1 emphasizes this cult-like mentality through its association to philosophy and the way in which philosophers and their concepts sort of become idolized. And that's also apparent within the history of philosophy as well, when certain schools of thought are developed around a specific person and their ideas. And some examples of those, of course, are Plato and his school within ancient Greece for the academy, and then also later on we have Descartes and the Cartesians and that whole view, and then later on in the 20th century we have phenomenology, which is like a refreshed Cartesianism, also pop up with a school of thought. Then in part 1 there was the overall general sort of thematic emphasis upon creativity and newness in the creation of new values and the problems in creation as well, emerging all from that and coming all from the first little part of part 1 as well, about the 3 metamorphoses from the camel, who is very much the character of the burdens of society, of social and cultural norms, and of ideas that ultimately burden us down, weigh us down, and then in comes the character of the lion, who's the one that does all the fighting with all this history of ideas that weigh us down, and then eventually in comes the idea of the child, who is the one that then creates new ideas, new values, after all the battling and fighting is done. And so part 2 overall has quite an emphasis upon our psychology and the importance of a psychological investigation into how we think, as well as an importance upon desire as well. And so I'll sort of leave those 2 concepts for the moment and then come back to them as well. Because what I want to then talk about first is what are the things that Nietzsche normally picks upon as critical points that also has overlap with the previous sections as well. And then that'll nicely lead us into the whole approach to do with desire and psychology. And so, as with the other parts, there's that emphasis upon the creation of an ideality. And we have this within philosophy, of course, in creating a metaphysics in order to therefore have a complete pure foundation in order to build upon. And so therefore a great example of that is Descartes, in which Descartes tries to create an absolutely pure metaphysical basis that's logically concrete and sound, because therefore if you can do that, you can have a nice foundation to therefore build upon for knowledge and how we should act ethically and so on. And then there has that whole relation as well into then the denial of our body and desire through that emphasis upon saying, well, any animality within us is bad because it ultimately leads us towards suffering. And then we have those lovely, wonderful sections as well that discuss Schopenhauer and the problems of Schopenhauer within Nietzsche as well, because not unlike religious approaches as well, we have also Schopenhauer take that same approach to say, well, all what we have within ourselves is this concept of the will, which is ultimately the design process within us. And that's going to be something that's going to be needing to be continually fulfilled. And the problem with it, and why do we always suffer from it, is because it's that sense of never being fulfilled and always needing satisfaction. And you can get into the easy examples of that, of course, of just continual hunger and needing to be continually just on the hunt for needing to be fed all the time, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and never therefore reaching that sustainable point of happiness, that sense of fulfillment, through that requiring of continual need for food. And then one of the main things that Schopenhauer argues for as well is the importance of music, and the way in which music is able to uplift us just temporarily and very momentarily away from our bodily suffering as we become sort of engrossed within the music that we listen to. And then, of course, then comes the problem of once the music's finished, you then go back to the state of suffering you were in previously. But at least, Schopenhauer would argue, we had that little momentary release from all that. But interestingly, in then comes a nice criticism from the Nietzsche side of things onto all this, is because we emphasize so much upon this ideal space, ultimately, within at least that musical appreciation. Sure, it pulls you out and you have that sublime experience through listening to the music. But the problem is, Nietzsche says, is that everyone is so focused upon the creation of this ideality and focused upon this ideal space that all what we have is presented to us within society is like this idealistic cloudland, which is a great concept from the section on poets, is how he says all what the poets do is create this idealistic cloudland that they're describing to us. And there's a great section as well where he says Zarathustra has become weary of all things that are unattainable, what is meant to be a reality, in the sense of everything that's, in the sense of that everything that is presented to us in reality is meant to be so horrible that then, of course, what's so much better about that is precisely the opposite of that, the ideality. And then, of course, you could have that whole point about, well, why is there so much focus on the ideality in the first place? Because it's meant to make us happy, because we have those moments that pull us out of suffering without having us have that whole aspect of focusing upon the cold, harsh reality of the situation. And so it provides that form of escapism. And that form of escapism therefore provides happiness. And then ethically as well, of course, then you could say, well, it provides us with a basis to perform good actions in that ideal space upon what you're ideally meant to do and meant to act and meant to perform. But what's so great as well, going back to what Zarathustra says about his weariness, is that point about when we suddenly become weary, or another good phrase is when we wake up and smell the coffee, basically, when we start to then question that ideality that's placed upon us. Why is that? What happens when that happens? Why is there so much emphasis upon this ideality in the first place? And so you get into all those sort of interesting questions, and one of the aspects that Nietzsche focuses on is the whole aspect of, well, there's all this emphasis, not only have we got a form of escapism that's meant to provide us a form of happiness, but also, well, people are going to argue for this idealistic plane, this cloudland, because it's going to provide us with a form of command and control over other people. And if you're not wanting to be the one that's in control of other people, what are you going to be doing? is ultimately you're going to be the one that wants to obey other people. And there's that whole sense of sort of in an everyday life situation as well, where you could say, well, in everyday life, really we have that specific ideal image about what's presented to us and about what we should achieve in life and what exactly our life should be set out to want to have ultimately. Let's say adhering to whatever the social and cultural norms of that given society would be. And what's so a great example, of course, of that is the American dream for American society, and precisely trying to attain that dream, acquire wealth. So therefore, trying to therefore attain a very luxurious lifestyle, not only just a house, but a luxurious house, a mansion, not only just a car, but a luxurious car. And so what's so great about what Nietzsche does as well is that then he starts to say, well, why is this so important? Why is this ideal plane presented to us? Because it allows for a form of control. Because whoever is arguing for whatever ideal plane it is allows for other people to become mesmerized by it. And once you become mesmerized by it, therefore they'll become herd-like. And we have that wonderful relation into herd mentality, and therefore wanting to obey what other people are telling us. And why do we obey it in the first place is because it's something that's meant to provide us happiness. And also all the work's already done for us as well. It's like the whole sense of coming home from a hard day's work and the meal's already prepared for you, the housework's already done, everything's hunky-dory, you just put your feet up, relax, and you've got nothing to do. You don't even have to think. Everything's already been done for you. All the hard work's done. And that's really the way in which Nietzsche says, well, this is what, at least traditionally within philosophy, and at least a part of it in relation to society as well, acts to present us with this ideal plane, this comfort that provides us happiness, that ultimately we're pretty much content as how we go. But then, of course, then the weariness happens at some given point, and therefore it becomes interesting, the very question of, well, why is that the case? Why does the weariness happen? Why do we become weary? And one of the answers to that, of course, is because we have that whole break with the ideality, because we wake up and smell the coffee, because we realize that what's presented to us is a complete load of rubbish. And therefore we have that sort of lion-like will, as he says, that need and passion to want to therefore challenge this ideal space and cloudland that's been presented to us. Why is that the case? Because at some given point as well, we realize that truth isn't something that's comfortable. Truth isn't something that you just sit on your butt and therefore allow it to happen. In fact, truth can be disturbing. And there's a really interesting point about it as well. One of the main points that comes out of part 2 is to say, well, truth is the manifestation of our desire. And so we get lovely into that whole aspect of psychology and the psychological approach as well. And to say, well, if truth is the manifestation of our desire, then how does everything work? And so, from a social and cultural point of view as well, society in itself is reflective of our desires, because we have ultimately shops that are solely based on your mouth. They're all the restaurants. They're all the fast food restaurants. They're McDonald's, they're Burger King, and so on. Then, of course, you have that desire for warmth and need for clothes, and then you have those shops. And then you have the whole point about desire and need for stuff like beds, and then you have those shops. And then you have the whole need for and desire to get rid of your trash, and therefore garbage men is therefore a desire. And so the whole aspect of society itself is based upon human desire. and it's very much a manifestation of our desire. On the other hand, then when we go into the whole philosophical aspects about it as well, then we could say, well, truth, all the deep things about life and knowledge are ultimately the psychological byproducts of those people creating them in the first place. What sort of level of control did they want? Why did they want that? Who did they want to have control over? These are the sort of interesting questions that can then pop up. And then you can start to look at things like Descartes differently, and the traditional philosophers all differently as well. Why are they creating this model in the first place? Why do they want this? Who do they want power over? And so one of the main points as well is that to say, well, once we get into the whole aspect of desire, then we can say, well, you can't view truth as this purely thing that's created in a very much formal aspect, in a very much academic way, that's like, say, a nice academic replying to another academic very formally, and all having a nice discussion and debate about certain topics. And therefore, one resolves the other's problem, and they congratulate each other on how nice the situation is, and they've all been able to resolve the problem. Nietzsche would say, rubbish. What's going on here? What's driving them? What's the desire and processes in the first place? Why is this happening now? Why this specific discussion? What are they trying to get out of it? And therefore asking the much more critical questions about it, rather than just viewing it as a lovely, nice little situation or debate. You could very much say that, interestingly as well, about the recent debate about Zizek and Jordan Peterson. What are they getting out of it? What's the desiring processes there? And so on. So that's a nice little contemporary philosophy debate as well that happened about the whole aspect of communism and so on, different topics that was discussed. And of course, what happens as well to these ideal models and these whole structures of knowledge is that they get upheld to not only a little collective, but they get upheld to the nth degree that therefore they have validity throughout time as well. And therefore, there's that whole Nietzsche aspect about, well, why is that the case? Why this specific person? Why not other people? Because there's that whole criticism as well that knowledge itself becomes static at that given point. When we uphold certain ideas and certain people and their ideas, then what about everybody else? Because that in itself denies the very production of knowledge. And therefore, the whole problem when we uphold things to that extent, Nietzsche really says is, well, knowledge becomes something that's unfruitful. Creativity and creation just doesn't happen. What is the whole academic process within that? What is the whole process at all? Because what is everyone just going to be doing is just sitting quite nice and happily on their butts, looking at books, therefore not even thinking. They're just going to be looking at what other people have thought and therefore repeating exactly what they think. And what a crap, rubbish system that would be if all what we were left with is this very robotic way of looking at things where there is no creativity because all the thought process is already done for us. And that's the point that Nietzsche wants to get out of. That's what he wants to snap us out of. This whole stop privileging everyone, stop privileging certain models, start thinking more critically about this, start thinking more critically about the people that are writing these things in the first place. Because if we do so, then we affirm not this idealistic cloudland, not this static form of knowledge, not where people become robotic and therefore conform, but rather the opposite of that. And what is Nietzsche going to be arguing for is the importance of philosophy as precisely that critical tool to therefore challenge and question any points in which this static aspect of knowledge occurs. When anything's upheld to a certain extent, nothing can move ultimately. And so it's that whole sense of when something's upheld to the level of idolatry in which it's so good, then there's no movement that can occur. is to say, well, you want movement to occur because you allow newness to therefore occur. And what does Nietzsche want in all given instances is for us to always affirm that difference and diversity. And also, interestingly enough, our flaws, and to say, well, we ourselves are flawed in our own views and how we think. And never to think we are completely perfect in our reasoning either. And you have that within philosophy as well, at least traditionally, trying to at least condition yourselves to think perfectly, think more rationally about things. And well, there's that point, that nice critical point to say, regardless how much you can condition yourself, regardless how much you practice at correcting yourself, you're still gonna make a mistake at some given point. But that's not in itself a bad thing. Mistakes are positive things, and therefore we shouldn't beat ourselves up when they do happen, because we should learn from them. They're a positive thing for why mistakes occur, why we ourselves hold false opinions about things at given times and therefore are flawed within our own views. So this goes nicely into the line as well from another section in part 2, that unchangeable ideas do not exist. There couldn't be a more line against traditional philosophy than that, really. Unchangeable ideas do not exist, because it's precisely against the very idea in the first place, because what does Nietzsche always want, as I just said as well, that movement, that affirmation of opinions, that knowledge is something that's in flux. And if it's in flux as well, and this whole idea of change, at least traditionally within philosophy, is always viewed as something very negative, because if it changes all the time, then how do we arrive at knowledge? And how do we arrive at something like meaning if that meaning would always be in a continual change? And so it's that whole importance as well as the problem of, therefore, the whole process of overthrowing and liberating and challenging ideals in the first place, because one of the main problems of that is that you just lose the foundation entirely. And therefore, a good immediate response to that would be, well, what's the point then? Because that foundation provides the basis. If you have nothing to replace it, then you shouldn't try to just remove it entirely to begin with. And it's that whole point, well, what is going to be that foundation? What is going to be that basis? And so we don't therefore arrive concretely at a nice foundational way of doing things like we would within traditional philosophy like Descartes or Kant or other people within Nietzsche, because that foundation is something that's problematical for us to have, because the foundation itself is argued should always be in that continual sense of flux and change and affirming change within it. And you say, well, that's not a very good foundation. You couldn't exactly build in a house on anything that's moving, because you would just have to therefore change location, get a nice new grounding set up, and then you can build it. But that's the point, is that you can't say that knowledge and structure of knowledge and thought and everything like that works in the same way that a house does. Because if we affirm all that change in the first place, no one takes preference one over the other. We always allow for that diversity and newness to take place, and therefore we always challenge this whole role that's set up between the aspect of commanding and obeying within each given thing that takes its role as the foundation at a given point. And so you could say, well, the whole point of establishing the foundation is because there's going to be something that we have to obey and they want to command us. But within that given point, we could only, and it's becoming very political philosophy at this sense of who do we allow ourselves to give our freedom up for, to allow for this foundation for knowledge to exist in the first place. But within that given system as well, it's that whole process of continually allowing it to always change and never to remain static. So the whole point is that we have this whole argument for a utopian style of society that's always presented to us in this very idealistic cloudland like manner, as Nietzsche would say. But what we ultimately always have is not a utopia, but precisely the opposite of that, a dystopia. Why is that the case? Because it precisely affirms sameness, affirms things always being the same. Go into that fantastic concept of the eternal return of the same for Nietzsche, the hell of that. And therefore, what do we want is that affirmation not of a return of the same, but continual return of difference. Because when we affirm difference, we affirm diversity, we affirm novelty, and therefore we continually challenge ideals. And that sort of nicely leads into argument for where Nietzsche wants us to go as well, and to say, well, therefore is a happy life based upon this ultimate continually being critical, continually challenging all the time, always being on the outlook with a pair of binoculars at the window, basically. And it's not that at all. It's becoming aware of the problems in the first place, challenging those problems, and then opening the door, as we do, for a different approach to take place in the first place. And it's that whole line-like nature we've got to have, as Nietzsche says, to have the whole purpose of wanting to challenge and open the door in the first place. And that our own happiness is not to be the paranoid person with a pair of binoculars looking out the window all the time. Because then the caricature would ultimately be James Stewart's character in the film Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock from 1954, where ultimately he's a wheel-bound photographer who spies on his neighbors from his apartment window and becomes convinced that one of them has committed murder. It says ultimately would turn into that character convinced that there's a conspiracy afoot at all given times. It's rather to say, well, our happiness shouldn't be upon this whole paranoia, but rather in trying to allow us to be that ox in the field, trying to lead a nice, natural, simple life, quite happily away there, in which we have a nice, healthy mental state. Because in the midst of all this, of course, within that loss of foundation, within the very idea of challenging in the first place, there's an incredible amount of mental health problems that would occur simultaneously. The whole aspect of anxiety and, precisely as we've been saying, paranoia. And so in the midst of all that, Nietzsche's sort of advocating, almost very slowly at times, the importance of our mental health as we go through Zarathustra as well, at least trying to achieve this form of happiness that's not based upon luxury, that's given to us in social and cultural norms, to therefore try and get the best house, the best car, and so on, but rather focus upon the simple things. And therefore we have quite a nice wee interest and relation into Epicureanism as well there, that one of the main things that Epicurus argues for is just to have what is natural and necessary. And so Epicureanism has quite a nice diet as well. One of the first sort of argued for vegetarian approaches, because what he argues is that meat is an unnecessary thing. We can get by solely on vegetables, and therefore we should only focus on what is natural and necessary to us. And therefore he'd be quite happily as well just solely drinking water. But rather, of course, what Nietzsche wants is just that idea of just being happy within that given instance as well, not really having a care in the world, not being paranoid and anxious, and allow us to enjoy ourselves a little bit. And as well as that, we have also, quite nicely, the importance of creativity is something that's very much therapeutic to us, that's argued for as well in part 2. So not only do we have this argument based upon happiness, getting away from anxiety, stress-free life basically, but also saying, well, on the other hand, how do we make ourselves happier as well? It's not just to be completely animals, of course, completely the ox in the field, but we are also creative individuals at the same time. And once we get in the midst of being creative and getting those creative juices flowing, as they say, then that's also a very great thing for us, because it manages to get around the whole problems of whatever mental health problems that's occurring, because we're letting it all out in a very productive and positive way. So overall then, for part 2, we have this whole relation into ideality, the creation of this whole cloudland. I love using that term that he has from the section of poets. Then, of course, we have the emphasis upon psychology, the whole psychological profiling of someone, because then that allows us to understand why a certain idea emerged at a given time period, what exactly are they doing, and allows us to basically understand the individual at a much deeper level, and truth as a manifestation of their desire, and therefore allowing us to understand their ideas as well at a deeper level. And then again, emphasizing the importance of philosophy as a critical tool, allowing us to help us challenge that ideality. And then also the importance upon our own happiness and mental well-being at the same time. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you liked my general discussion of part 2 of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to subscribe to my Patreon at patreon.com/dissecting philosophy. Feel free to also drop me an email at my address dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and it can be also found on Twitter at I am a rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me next time.